At only 19 years old, she was forced to marry a 74-year-old king. Prepare yourselves for a journey to the winter of 1817, where you will meet Margaret Blackwood, a young woman sold as merchandise who became a queen in essence. A narrative about dignity confronting cruelty, about imprisoned hearts discovering wings. Where are you watching from? Leave your city in the comments. And if you believe stories can transform, subscribe and leave your like. Every gesture allows us to continue bringing narratives that warm the soul. Now take a deep breath and imagine. Year winter of 1817, location, Ashford, Kent, England. The January rain fell like icy tears over Ashford, turning the streets of Kent into rivers of dark mud. In the Blackwood house, an old decaying estate, the cold seeped through the cracks and coiled itself in the bones of those who lived there. Margaret Blackwood was 19 years old, her hands bleeding from cracks caused by cold water and cheap soap. Seated by the window, she watched the desolate landscape while mending for the third time the same wool dress. Her fingers kept rhythm with her mother's labored breathing in the next room. Catherine and Anne played in the corner of the room with mended rag dolls, their muffled laughter trying to disguise the hunger that gnawed at their bellies. The last piece of bread from that morning had been divided 3 ways, and Margaret had lied, saying she had already eaten. The lie tasted of preserved dignity, and she swallowed it with a sip of cold tea. The sound of Thomas Blackwood's boots on the stairs made the silence descend like a heavy shroud. Margaret knew that irregular, heavy gait, steeped in alcohol and terrible decisions. Catherine, at 14, wrapped Anne in a protective embrace. The door opened unceremoniously. Thomas brought the smell of tobacco, brandy, and official paper. His eyes, once noble, were murky pools where humanity was drowning. "Margaret," his voice was a distant thunder, "come down. There is a gentleman who requires to see you." It was not an invitation. It was an order, and the tone carried something that made Margaret's heart clench like a fist. She placed her sewing on the chair, smoothed the mended dress with her palms, and descended the stairs, each step creaking like an omen. In the parlor, stripped of its sold-off furniture, stood a middle-aged man of discreet elegance. He was not the king, but his representative, a lawyer with an expressionless face and a briefcase full of papers that would decide fates. "This is my daughter, Margaret," Thomas announced. "As you can see, she is of good appearance, healthy, educated as a lady." The man studied Margaret with clinical eyes. She kept her spine straight, her chin high. "His Majesty will be satisfied," he declared, and something in the phrase made Margaret's world tremble. When the stranger left, taking with him the promise to return in 3 days, Thomas turned to his daughter with a smile that was more terrible than any scowl. "You have been blessed, Margaret. King Edmund III of Westfield has requested your hand in marriage." The words fell like stones on a frozen lake, cracking the surface of reality. Margaret felt her legs weaken, but she did not fall. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. "The king is 74 years old," she whispered, her voice weak but firm. "Hand £20,000, Thomas retorted, his mask of false joy falling away to reveal the hungry face of a gambler. £20,000 that will settle every one of my debts, that will save this house, that will guarantee your sister's future." Margaret looked at the man who should have protected her. She saw not a father, but a tired merchant negotiating his last valuable piece of merchandise. "And if I refuse?" The words escaped before good sense could censor them. The slap was quick and precise, cracking against her face like a gunshot. Margaret staggered, her hand flying to her burning cheek, her eyes watering not from physical pain but from the brutal confirmation of her complete powerlessness. "Oh, you will not refuse," Thomas hissed, bringing his face close to hers. "You will accept this marriage with gratitude. You will save this family from the ruin my weakness has caused. It is the least you can do." That night, Margaret went up to her mother's room. Elizabeth Blackwood was reclining against thin pillows, her body a shadow of what it once was. Tuberculosis was advancing slowly, stealing her breath, coloring her cheeks with a false, feverish blush. When Margaret entered, Elizabeth extended a trembling hand. "I know," she murmured, tears streaming down her wasted face. "Forgive me. Forgive us." Margaret knelt beside the bed, held that hand that was more bone than flesh, and felt something harden inside her. It wasn't anger. It was something older, purer. It was the decision to survive. "There is nothing to forgive, Mother," she whispered, kissing the cold fingers. "I will do what is necessary." 3 days later, when the royal carriage appeared, adorned with gilding that hurt the eyes, Margaret realized her old life was dying. Elizabeth removed a silver locket from her neck and placed it on Margaret. "This is you," she whispered, touching her daughter's face. "Don't let them forget who you are. Margaret climbed into the carriage and the world she knew began to pull away. She did not look back. To look back would be to crumble, a luxury that merchandise could not afford. What she didn't know was that she was not being taken to a golden tomb. She was being taken to her coronation. The journey lasted 6 hours through landscapes that transformed from desolation to restrained majesty. Margaret watched from the window, her face serene while inside she counted every heartbeat like one counting minutes of freedom. When Thornfield Palace emerged, Margaret had to suppress a gasp. It was a white stone structure, with 4 towers reaching for the sky, formal gardens in perfect patterns, an artificial lake reflecting the building. It was a beauty that ached, completely inaccessible. The carriage stopped before the marble steps. Lackeys emerged like synchronized shadows, opening doors, extending gloved hands. Margaret accepted the assistance and descended, her shoes touching the ground of her new kingdom for the first time. A woman of about 60 awaited at the top of the stairs. She had a rigidly straight back, grey hair pinned in a severe bun, and eyes that appraised Margaret like a merchant appraising suspicious goods. She wore black as if in perpetual mourning, and her gloved hands held a closed fan as if it were a weapon. "Lady Beatrice Ashford," she announced in a voice that could cut glass, "Lady Chamberlain of this palace. You will be conducted to your quarters to prepare yourself appropriately before being presented to His Majesty." There was no welcome, there was no kindness. There was only the protocol, as cold as the marble beneath Margaret's feet. She followed Lady Ashford through endless corridors, each more opulent than the last. Paintings of ancestors stared down from the walls, with expressions ranging from disdain to curiosity. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Persian rugs muffled their steps. It was a world of silent, intimidating beauty. Her apartments were larger than the entire Blackwood house. A 4-poster bed covered in silk embroidered with gold thread. Windows overlooking the gardens. A marble fireplace promising warmth. "Your maids will arrive shortly," Lady Ashford announced. "The ceremony will be tomorrow at noon." Margaret was left alone in her golden prison. Night fell. Maids came and went, bringing scented baths, silk gowns, and food that Margaret barely touched. Margaret lay down, expecting him to come, the elderly king. Every sound in the palace made her flinch, but no one came. The night passed in a vigil, and when morning arrived, Margaret knew she had waited for an inevitability that had not occurred. What she didn't know was that King Edmund III had spent that same night awake in his own quarters, coughing blood into a handkerchief he hid from his doctors, and planning how to give a young woman sold as merchandise the one thing £20,000 could not buy: freedom. The next morning dawned with a heavy silence, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. Margaret was awakened not by sunlight, but by the soft hands of the maids who entered her room with the discretion of ghosts. They bathed her, combed her brown hair into elaborate braids, and dressed her in a reception gown of moss-green velvet that cost more than everything her family had ever owned. She observed it all through a fog, as if she were a doll being readied for display. No one spoke to her beyond what was strictly necessary. No one met her eyes. "His Majesty will receive you in the private audience chamber," one of the older women announced, her voice respectful. "It is a great honor." Margaret nodded, because what else could she do? She followed the procession through the corridors, now lit by daylight, watching how the sunbeams made the chandelier crystals dance in prismatic rainbows on the walls. Cold beauty, distant beauty, beauty that warmed nothing. The audience chamber was smaller than she had imagined, more intimate. A lit fireplace, worn leather armchairs, shelves of well-used books. It was not a throne room. It was almost a home. And there, sitting with a blanket over his knees, was King Edmund III. Margaret had braced herself for terrible images: a decadent monster, a cruel tyrant, a lecherous old man. What she found stole all her preparation. Edmund was frail in a way that suggested illness. His hair was pure white as snow, his eyes a faded blue, and when they fixed on Margaret, she saw something unexpected: kindness. He did not rise, he seemed to lack the strength, but he gestured to the opposite armchair with a hand that was trembling but elegant. "Lady Margaret." His voice was weak, hoarse, but carried centuries of aristocratic breeding. "Please sit." "Dismiss us," he added, addressing the maids, who curtsied and withdrew in silence. For the first time since setting foot in Thornfield, Margaret was alone with the man who would be her husband. The silence stretched between them like a taut thread. Margaret kept her hands clasped in her lap, her back straight, her gaze fixed on an indistinct point. Every muscle in her body was tensed, prepared for what? Flight? Submission? She didn't know. "You are afraid," Edmund observed, and it was not a question. "It is natural. If I were you, I would be too." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yes, Your Majesty, I am." He smiled, and it was a sad smile that carried decades of loneliness. Honesty. What a rare gift. A sudden cough seized him, shaking his fragile body. He covered his mouth with a handkerchief that Margaret noted had faint old bloodstains. When the cough passed, Edmund leaned back, exhausted. "I saw you 18 months ago," he began. "In London at a charity event for veterans. You spoke with a young man who had lost both legs." He was weeping. Others looked away. "But you knelt, held his hands and listened. You offered him dignity." The words made something break inside Margaret. "Genuine compassion," Edmund whispered, "is the rarest thing in my world, rarer than gold, and you possess it naturally. So you bought me for that?" Margaret retorted, bitter. Edmund was not offended. He nodded slowly. "Your father is a man who drowned his honor in brandy. When I learned he was selling his daughter to settle gambling debts, I saw an opportunity. Not to possess you, child, to free you." Margaret blinked, confused. "Free me by forcing me into marriage? Come with me." Edmund extended his hand. "There is something I must show you." He rose with difficulty, leaning on a cane. Margaret offered her arm. Together they walked through the palace, Edmund pausing to catch his breath. He showed her the vast library, thousands of volumes, more books than she could read in 10 lifetimes. "All of this is at your disposal," he said. Then the gardens with roses protected in hothouses, stables with magnificent horses, a refurbished wing with classrooms for the children of the kingdom, nobles and commoners side by side. Revolutionary, they say. I say it is just. Finally, they stopped before the royal chapel. It was a delicate structure, all white stone and stained glass that painted the floor with celestial colors. Edmund entered slowly and Margaret followed. On the altar there was a simple marble tombstone. Isabel Marie, Queen of Westfield, beloved wife, eternal light. 45 years of marriage, Edmund murmured, kneeling with difficulty before the tomb. Margaret knelt beside him. She was my sun, my moon, my reason for waking each morning. When she left 5 years ago, a part of me left with her. He touched the stone with trembling fingers. Isabel believed true nobility came not from blood, but from actions, that a kingdom was measured not by its wealth, but by how it treated its most vulnerable. She would have loved you, Margaret. Your Majesty, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. I do not understand. Why me? Why this? Edmund turned to her, and there were tears in the corners of his faded eyes. Because I am dying, child, and because I have one last act of justice to perform before I join my Isabel. The revelation fell on Margaret like ice water. She looked at this frail man, at the bloodstains on his handkerchief, at the pallor of his skin, and she understood. Tomorrow you will be my wife before God and the court, Edmund continued, but not in bed. Never in bed. You will be queen in name but free in spirit. And when I leave, I will leave you something that £20,000 could never buy. What? Margaret could barely breathe. Edmund smiled, the smile of a man who had just defeated his own destiny. A future, of your own choosing. That afternoon, when Margaret returned to her apartments, she was no longer merchandise. She was a co-conspirator, and the dying king who had bought her had just made her something infinitely more dangerous. A woman with hope. The ceremony was grand in a way that felt painful. Margaret walked down the aisle in white satin embroidered with pearls, a tiara that had belonged to Isabel sparkling in her hair. The veil turned the world into a white haze. Edmund waited at the altar, leaning on his cane, wearing an ermine robe and crown. When Margaret reached him, she felt the tremor in those fingers. It was not desire. It was weakness. They exchanged vows and rings. Edmund kissed her forehead with paternal tenderness, not marital. Welcome, Queen Margaret, he whispered. That night, after the celebration, Edmund came to her quarters. He carried documents. I have tuberculosis, in its advanced stages. The doctors give me 8 months to a year. Margaret had already suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality land. Westfield has no direct heirs, Edmund continued. During the time I have left, I will teach you everything. You will inherit as Queen Regent until a proper succession is established. The court will never accept it, Margaret objected. They see me as a social climber. They will come to respect you, Edmund said with fierce conviction, because I will command it, because the royal will shall require it, and because you will prove day after day that you deserve the crown more than any blue blood who has never known a day of suffering. He placed his hands over hers, and there was urgency in his touch. Margaret, precious child, you were sold like cattle. Your father treated you as merchandise. The world told you that you had no value beyond your beauty and your virginity. I am going to give you something no one can take away. What? She could barely speak. True power, Edmund whispered. Not the power to rule over others, but the power to rule your own life, the power to change destinies, the power to prove that every person who underestimated you was absolutely wrong. Tears now streamed freely down Margaret's face. They were not tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Gratitude, disbelief, terror, hope, all mixed into an emotion without a name. "Why?" she sobbed. "Why would you do this for me?" Edmund wiped her tears away. "Because Isabel would have done the same. Because compassion deserves to be rewarded. And because the only thing that matters is leaving the world better than you found it." That night, Margaret decided to follow this map to the end. Because if a dying man could have hope, so could she. The months transformed Margaret in unimaginable ways. Every morning she met with Edmund in the library for lessons that lasted hours. He taught with patience, though interrupted by coughs that stained handkerchiefs red. They spoke of treaties, delicate alliances. They studied maps, economics, philosophies of government. "A kingdom is not land," Edmund would say. "It is the people who live on it. Every decision must begin with, does this serve my subjects or my vanity?" Margaret absorbed everything with the hunger of one who had been starved of education. She discovered she had a sharp mind for numbers, for strategy, for patterns. Edmund brought her to the royal council meetings, where 6 lords gathered monthly. They were men who watched Margaret with expressions shifting from disdain to distrust. Lord Hertford, the eldest, barely disguised his contempt. "With respect, matters of tariffs are beyond feminine comprehension." "Then explain," Edmund said coolly, "why the proposed tariffs would harm our merchants while benefiting London monopolists." Hertford stammered. Edmund turned to Margaret. "Queen Margaret, your analysis." "The tariffs would increase costs by 18%, she replied firmly. "In 6 months, half of our producers would go bankrupt. Monopolists would buy their lands for nothing." She met Hertford's gaze. "This does not require feminine comprehension, just basic arithmetic." Lord Pemberton, the youngest, began to laugh. "By God, Edmund, you've found one with a brain." It was the first time Margaret heard Dr. William Pemberton speak. He was the King's personal physician, and also the Duke of Greystone, an unusual combination. He was perhaps in his late 30s, his face serious but not severe, and he had a surgeon's hands, precise, confident. His eyes met Margaret's across the table, and she saw something there that made her stiffen her spine. Defiance. He was testing her just like the others. The difference was, he seemed willing to accept her if she passed the test. In the following months, William Pemberton became a constant presence. As Edmund's doctor, he visited daily to monitor the inevitable decline. As a duke and advisor, he participated in the study sessions, adding a medical and practical perspective to Edmund's theories. And always he watched Margaret with those unreadable eyes. One March afternoon, as the first flowers began to defy winter in the gardens, Edmund suggested a walk. He was having a good day, no violent coughs, more colour in his cheeks. William accompanied them, officially to ensure the king didn't overexert himself. They walked slowly through the formal gardens, Edmund between Margaret and William, holding both their arms for balance. The air was still crisp, but there was a promise of spring in the smell of thawing earth. "Tell me about your projects for the kingdom, Margaret," Edmund said suddenly. "If you had unlimited resources, what would you change?" Margaret had thought about this, in the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. "Schools," she answered without hesitation. "Public schools where children of all classes could learn together. Nobles and workers' sons side by side." William let out a sound of surprise. "Revolutionary." "Necessary," Margaret corrected, turning to face him. "Ignorance perpetuates poverty. Poverty perpetuates suffering. If we want a better kingdom, we need educated citizens." "And how would you finance this?" William challenged, but there was genuine curiosity in his voice now. "Such projects cost fortunes." "By redirecting resources from excessive court festivities," Margaret answered readily. "Last year's gala ball cost £3,000. That could fund a school for 2 years." Edmund laughed, delighted. "You've done your homework." "I always do," Margaret said simply. William studied her with new intensity. "Do you truly believe you can change the world with schools and hospitals?" "Not the world." Margaret met his eyes without flinching. "But perhaps a few lives. And if a few lives change, perhaps they will change others. And eventually—" She left the sentence unfinished, a silent challenge. Something shifted in William's face. It wasn't approval yet, but the hostility had evaporated. "Edmund," he said slowly, still looking at Margaret, "you may have made the right choice after all." "I know," Edmund replied quietly. "I always knew." That night, after a formal dinner where Margaret executed every protocol perfectly, she returned to her quarters and found a sealed letter on her desk. The wax seal was the Greystone crest. With slightly trembling fingers, she opened it. Your Majesty, I must offer an apology. I judged you hastily, assuming you were like others who seek power through convenient marriage. I was wrong. You are something rare, someone who carries a title but maintains her humanity. I would like to offer my assistance with your hospital project. I have medical experience that could be valuable. If you accept, we can discuss details at your convenience. Respectfully, William Pemberton, Duke of Greystone. Margaret reread the letter 3 times. It was not a declaration of friendship. It was not a complete surrender. But it was a bridge being extended over the chasm of mistrust between them. She took a quill and paper and wrote a simple reply. Duke of Greystone, I accept your assistance with gratitude. Edmund has taught me that transforming a kingdom requires alliances, not isolation. I will arrange a meeting to discuss the hospital specifics. Queen Margaret. When she sealed the letter, she didn't realize she was smiling for the first time since she had arrived at Thornfield. Outside, in a window on the other side of the courtyard, Edmund watched the light burning in the Queen's apartments. Beside him, leaning against the cold stone wall, William stared in the same direction. She is remarkable, William murmured. She is exactly what you need, Edmund corrected gently. William turned to look at the king. Edmund, you are... I am dying, William, Edmund interrupted without rancor. Doctors don't lie to other doctors. Months, perhaps weeks. And before I go, I need to ensure that 2 people I deeply admire do not waste the chance to find what Isabel and I had. Edmund, you love her. It wasn't a question. I saw it in your eyes when you defended her in the council, when you argued medical philosophy, when she smiled and you forgot to breathe for 3 seconds. William closed his eyes. Even if it's true, she is your wife. On paper, Edmund said firmly. Only on paper. And when I am gone, she will be a free widow. You are my chosen heir, William. You will become king. And she needs someone who will love her not for the title, but for the fierce woman hiding beneath the crown. You planned this from the beginning, William realized, awed and horrified. I plan to give you both a chance, Edmund corrected. The rest is up to you. The 2 men remained at the window, watching the distant light, each lost in thought about destiny, death, and the strange kindness of a king using his last days to orchestrate not tragedy but hope. The spring transformed Thornfield. Margaret and William worked together daily, debating the hospital's location, discussing specialization versus basic infrastructure. Edmund watched these intellectual battles, smiling from behind his teacup. William was more than an advisor. He was Edmund's distant nephew, raised in the palace since age 12 when his parents died. Edmund and Isabel had treated him as a son. The projects moved forward. Margaret presented the proposal for the school and hospital to the council. Lord Hertford objected vigorously. The Crown's role is to maintain order and tradition, not radical social experiments, Hertford thundered. With respect, Margaret kept her voice calm. Education and health are human necessities. Westfield's tradition has always been compassion, William intervened, putting forth not just his support but material resources. I will offer part of my own lands for the hospital. It was an immense political gesture. Hertford nodded stiffly, defeated. When the meeting ended, Margaret caught up with William. William? He had invited her to use his name. You may call me William. Then you must call me Margaret. Something passed between them in the stone corridor. Mutual recognition, fascination, the beginning of something more. Days later, Edmund suffered a violent coughing attack. Margaret and William carried him to his quarters. When Edmund finally slept, William and Margaret met in the library. He is dying faster, William said, his voice hoarse. Weeks, perhaps days. Margaret placed her hand over his. Then we will make every day count. They remained there for hours, hands intertwined, united in a vigil over the dying king who loved them enough to orchestrate their destinies, while his own slipped away. Summer arrived with an unusual heat. Edmund had good days and terrible days. On the good ones, he sat in the gardens watching Margaret and William work. The school was nearly complete, the hospital rising ambitiously. On the terrible days, he did not leave his bed. Margaret sat beside him reading, refusing to leave him alone. One August night, Margaret escaped to the gardens. She sat by the lake, dipping her feet in the cool water. For a moment, she was just Margaret Blackwood, not the Queen. You come here often, William came from the shadows. Whenever the council is cruel. Hertford called me a failed experiment, Margaret confessed. But he's right, isn't he? She turned to look at him. When Edmund is gone, how long until they depose me? They will try and fail, William said, because you are not an experiment. You are a revolution. The silence stretched, pregnant with unsaid things. William, No, he interrupted. Not yet. Edmund still lives. But when I finally allow myself to love you, it will be in the light of day, not hidden in nocturnal gardens. Then we will wait, Margaret whispered. And after? After we will discover who we are. And what I feel is not a passing passion. It is recognition. As if my soul has found its other half. Inside the palace, Edmund awoke and ordered writing materials. He wrote for hours, 2 long sealed letters, to be opened after my death. In the following weeks, Edmund deteriorated dramatically. One September morning, he asked to be taken to the chapel. He knelt before Isabel's tomb. Soon, my love, he whispered. I did well. I gave them to each other. 3 days later, on a quiet Friday, as rain began to fall, King Edmund III passed away peacefully. Margaret and William were holding his hands. Isabel, I am coming home, were his last words. The palace bell tolled. Westfield stopped. Flags were lowered. National mourning was declared. Margaret, a widow at 20, held William's hand and knew that although she had lost a king and a mentor, she had gained something precious. She had gained wings. The funeral lasted 3 days. Margaret wore full black, remaining beside the coffin for hours, the perfect image of a royal widow. Inside she was broken. Edmund had been the first man to treat her as a human being with value. After the burial, Margaret found a sealed envelope in her quarters. Edmund's letter revealed everything. He had researched her before buying her. He knew of her sacrifices. He had planned every moment. William was technically next in the line of succession. Edmund had orchestrated everything so they would fall in love. You and William have the same connection Isabel and I had. Do not waste it over grief or protocol. Govern together. Love each other openly. Be happy. William entered, holding an identical letter. They both wept. He planned it all, William realized. He purposefully made us fall in love. And it worked, Margaret whispered. He is gone, William said. There is no more need to hide. Margaret moved closer. Then kiss me. Edmund gave us his blessing. The kiss was everything a forbidden promise should be, urgent and gentle, desperate and patient. It was a kiss that honored Edmund and celebrated the love he had dreamed for them. Edmund laughed at death, William said, awed. He planted seeds that would bloom long after he was gone. That night they stayed together until dawn, planning, weeping, healing. Edmund was not dead. He lived in every reform. Every life touched, every moment of shared love. The next morning brought brutal reality. The council convened an emergency session. Margaret entered wearing mourning attire, but with her crown. William sat at the throne. Lord Hertford opened. Succession must be established. And there are concerns about the legitimacy of your position, Majesty. He looked at Margaret. A young widow. Their marriage never consummated according to rumors. It was a brutal accusation that Margaret was not truly queen. My marriage was legal and recognized. Margaret remained impassive. Consummation is not a requirement. Still, another councillor interjected. A young queen with no experience. No experience. William stood. Queen Margaret commands treaties better than half this council. She has implemented reforms that show results. And she has the loyalty of the people. The people are easily manipulated, Hertford dismissed. If your tradition is to preserve power for the privileged, Margaret rose, then I reject that tradition completely. Hertford smiled predatorily. You were seen on the night after the funeral in the Queen's quarters for hours. This council cannot support a succession where impropriety stains Edmund's memory. It was a coup d'etat disguised as protocol. Edmund's will allows no interpretation, Margaret declared. He granted me full power. To question this is to question a king's will. Wills can be contested, Hertford countered. When written by a man under heavy medication, William moved toward Hertford. Careful. You dance between council and insurrection. Enough, Margaret ordered. If Hertford wishes to contest, let the subjects decide. A public tribunal. An open hearing, with the people of Westfield voting on my legitimacy. It was an unprecedented and brilliant gamble. Margaret had the love of the people. Hertford understood the trap too late. The meeting ended in turmoil. When they were alone, Margaret trembled in William's embrace. That was risky, he murmured. It was necessary, she replied. Edmund did not free me just so I could bow. 2 weeks until the tribunal. 2 weeks to prove that a purchased girl deserved to rule a kingdom. The 2 weeks before the tribunal were a whirlwind of preparation. Margaret met with each councillor individually, building alliances, listening to concerns, demonstrating her knowledge. She visited the towns and villages around Thornfield, speaking with farmers, artisans, and merchants. William worked in parallel, ensuring the tribunal would be fair. Neutral judges, clear procedures, equal opportunity for both sides to present their case. Margaret's family came for the trial. Elizabeth, healthier now under proper medical care, embraced her daughter with tears. Kate and Anne, Now elegant young women educated at a ladies' school looked at their sister with reverent awe. Even Thomas appeared, sober for 6 months, working as a minor administrator in the kingdom. He avoided looking directly at Margaret, shame heavy on his shoulders. "Father," Margaret called to him the night before the tribunal. He turned slowly. "Your Majesty." "Margaret," she corrected gently. "I was always Margaret, even when you sold me like cattle." Thomas flinched as if slapped. I have no right to ask for forgiveness." "No," she agreed, "but I will give it to you anyway." He blinked, confused. "You did me a terrible wrong," Margaret continued, "but you inadvertently gave me the greatest gift. You forced me to Thornfield, where I found my purpose, my love, my true self. So I forgive you, Father, not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred is a weight I no longer wish to bear." Thomas crumbled, his knees hitting the marble floor, sobs shaking his body. "You became what I never was. You have the honor I sold for cheap brandy." Margaret knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then be an honorable man from now on. That is the only payment I ask." It was a moment of imperfect, incomplete, but real healing. And when Margaret stood up, she felt slightly lighter. The day of the tribunal dawned clear, the autumn sun shining on Westfield like a blessing. Thornfield's main square had been transformed into an open-air court, a raised platform for the judges, separate areas for Margaret and Hertford to present their cases, and a huge space for the subjects who had come by the hundreds. Margaret dressed not in ornate royal robes, but in a simple dark blue suit, the same shade she had worn when she first arrived at Thornfield 8 months prior. It was a subtle reminder of her journey. William sat with the councillors who supported her. He could not stand by her side publicly. The tribunal had to appear impartial, but his eyes never left her. The presiding judge, Lord Chancellor Harrison, opened the proceedings. "We are gathered to determine the matter of royal succession. Lord Hertford contests Queen Margaret's legitimacy to maintain full authority, alleging undue influence over the late King Edmund during his illness. Queen Margaret defends herself, invoking the right of the people to decide. Let each side present their case." Hertford rose first. He presented evidence. Witnesses claiming Edmund was often under heavy medication, documents showing the will was written only 3 months before his death, insinuations about the nature of the marriage. King Edmund, Hertford argued, was a good man but weak in his final months. He was manipulated by a young, ambitious woman who saw an opportunity in a dying elder. She took advantage of his loneliness, his grief for Isabel, to plant ideas of radical reform that destabilize Westfield's traditions. It was a skillful construction of lies and half-truths. Hertford painted Margaret as a calculating seductress, Edmund as a senile old man. When Hertford finished, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt panic rise. What if it worked? What if the people believed him? Then it was her turn. She stood, moving to the center of the platform. She had no prepared papers, no notes, only the truth. "People of Westfield," she began, her voice firm but not loud. "I did not come from a noble line. I came from a ruined family, where my alcoholic father sold me as merchandise to settle gambling debts. I was purchased for £20,000 and sent to Thornfield to marry a man 55 years my senior." The crowd hushed, shocked by the brutal honesty. "I expected a prison. I expected to serve conjugal duties to an elder who owned me like property. I expected to die slowly in a gilded cage. Just another forgotten transaction." She paused, letting the words land. "But King Edmund III was a man who saw me not as merchandise, but as a human. He knew he was dying, and he decided his last months would be dedicated not to his own satisfaction, but to preparing the kingdom for a better future." Margaret walked the platform, making eye contact with faces in the crowd. "Edmund taught me governance. He taught me history, economics, diplomacy, not because he was senile, but because he saw potential no one else did. He believed the compassion I showed a wounded soldier was more valuable than blue blood." She turned to Hertford. "Lord Hertford alleges I manipulated Edmund. But ask yourselves who benefits from my reforms, not me. Not the palace, you schools where children of any class learn. A hospital where treatment doesn't cost a fortune. Labor laws that protect, not exploit." Murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the crowd. "Edmund was not senile when he wrote his will," Margaret continued, passion rising in her voice. "He was lucid, clear, and absolutely resolute. He chose me not despite my humble origins, but because of them. Because I knew the suffering that nobles never have. Because I understood hunger, fear, and desperation. And because he believed a good queen governs not from an ivory tower, but from the experience of real life." She stopped, took a deep breath. "So I ask you, people of Westfield, Have I earned this crown? Have I proven in 8 months that I can rule with wisdom, compassion, and strength? Or should I remove it and let men like Hertford return Westfield to traditions that serve the privileged while you suffer? The square exploded. Cries of support echoed. Queen Margaret! Long live the Queen! Justice for Margaret! But Margaret raised a hand, calling for silence. I do not want acclamation by emotion. I want a decision by reason. So I will give you final evidence. She motioned, and servants brought forth large chests. These are letters I have received in the last 8 months. 3,217 letters from the subjects of Westfield. Mothers thanking me for the school where their children learn. Farmers thanking me for fair tax laws. War veterans thanking me for the hospital. Widows thanking me for assistance funds. 3,000 testimonies of lives I have touched. Not through manipulation, but through the compassionate policy Edmund taught me. Tears were streaming down faces in the crowd now. People were nodding, weeping, shouting their support. Hertford says I do not deserve to rule because I have no lineage, Margaret concluded, her voice breaking with emotion. I say I deserve to rule because I have something more valuable. I have a heart that bleeds when you bleed. I have the determination to never forget where I came from. And I have the blessing of a man who died believing that a purchased girl could become a queen worth having. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then like an avalanche the crowd roared. It was not polite acclaim. It was an explosion of love, loyalty, and conviction. Judge Harrison did not need to count votes. The verdict was obvious, but he followed procedure. Let all who support Queen Margaret remaining in full authority. Please stand. The entire square rose as one body. Only Hertford and 2 other councillors remained seated. The verdict is unanimous, Harrison declared. Queen Margaret remains in full royal authority. Case closed. Margaret staggered, her legs nearly failing. William was there instantly, breaking protocol to support her. The crowd saw and approved with even louder roars. Hertford stood, his face red with fury and humiliation. He left without a word, utterly defeated. That night, after celebrations that lasted into the dawn, Margaret stood alone in the library. She touched the armchair where Edmund used to sit, almost feeling his presence. We won, she whispered, just as you knew we would. A soft breeze moved the curtains, carrying the scent of roses from the gardens, and Margaret chose to believe it was Edmund, answering from beyond. She had been purchased. She had been freed. And now, finally, completely indisputably, she was queen not by transaction but by choice. The people's choice. And that crown, the one earned with battles and truth, was heavier and more precious than any made of gold. Winter came and went. Westfield buried itself under snow that turned the palace into a fairy tale castle, silent and timeless. Margaret and William worked tirelessly, no longer hiding their closeness. Society watched, speculated, but no longer opposed. The school flourished. 60 children now, from farmers' sons to dukes' daughters, learning side by side. The hospital saved lives daily, with William personally training young doctors in innovative techniques. In February, Margaret convened the council with an announcement. The Duke of Greystone and I will marry in the spring, she declared, not asking for permission. The ceremony will be simple, as William wishes. Edmund gave us his blessing. The people have given us their approval. The council can either accept graciously or oppose fruitlessly. The choice is yours. There was no Hertford to argue. He had retired to his country estates after the public humiliation. The remaining councillors nodded, some enthusiastic, others resigned. Lord Pemberton, the youngest councillor, smiled. Congratulations, Your Majesties. Edmund would be ecstatic. In March, Margaret received an unexpected visit. Edmund's lawyer arrived with a second set of sealed letters. King Edmund instructed me to deliver these on your wedding anniversary to the Duke of Greystone, he explained. But given that the wedding has not yet occurred, he specified an alternate date, 3 months after the public tribunal. He predicted, it seems, that there would be obstacles. Margaret and William opened the letters together in the gardens, where the roses were beginning to show pale green buds. Edmund's letter to William was brief. My boy, if you are reading this, then Margaret has passed through fire and emerged as a true queen. And you, ever honourable, have waited the proper time before admitting your love for her. Wait no longer. Life is short, even when we have decades ahead. Do not waste days when you could be having moments. Marry her. Love her fiercely. Give her children who will carry her compassion and your wisdom. And govern Westfield as Isabel and I did, together equals partners in all things. You were the son I never had. She is the daughter I wish I'd had. Make me proud not just by being good rulers, but by being happy. With eternal love, Edmund. Margaret's letter was longer, detailing instructions for every project they had begun, advice on political navigation, and wisdom on governance. But it ended with a paragraph that brought tears streaming down her face. "Margaret, when I saw you that day in London, kneeling beside that broken soldier, I knew I had found a rarity, a soul that had not been corrupted despite its suffering. The world tries to crush such souls. I decided to protect yours. I hope that when you read this, you are about to marry William. I hope you have discovered that true love is not imprisonment, but liberation. And I hope that when you look in the mirror, you see not a purchased girl, but a woman who bought herself back with courage, intelligence, and unwavering compassion. You are and always were exactly what this kingdom needed." With infinite pride, Edmund, Margaret folded the letter carefully, placing it against her heart. He knew every step, every obstacle. He had already lived it all in his mind. "He loved us too much to leave it to chance," William said softly. "He orchestrated our future because he knew he wouldn't be here to protect it." They sat in silence for a long time, honoring the man who had loved them so completely that his love transcended death itself. The wedding ceremony took place in April, when Westfield was exploding in flowers. It was not in the royal cathedral, but in the Thornfield Gardens under an arch of white roses. Margaret wore a simple cream silk dress, her hair loose down her back. William wore his military uniform, not royal robes. Margaret's family was present. Elizabeth healthy and radiant, Kate and Anne as bridesmaids. Thomas watched from the back, silent tears of redemption streaming down his face. William himself spoke the vows he had written. "Margaret, you came into my life as a queen, but you won my heart as a woman. I promise to love you not as a king loves a consort, but as a man loves an equal. I promise to protect not your fragility, but your strength. I promise to be worthy not of your crown, but of your trust," Margaret replied, her voice firm. "William, you saw me when I was still learning to see myself. I promise to rule at your side as a partner, not a shadow. I promise to challenge you when necessary, support you always, and love you not despite our differences, but because of them." When they kissed, the garden erupted in applause. And from somewhere above, unseen but present, Margaret felt Edmund's approval. The celebration that followed was joyous but not extravagant. Subjects were invited, not just nobles. Children from the school performed songs. Patients from the hospital sent letters of congratulations. At night, when they were finally alone in the royal apartments they would now share, William took Margaret's face in his hands. "Queen Margaret," he murmured, "my wife, my partner, my life." "King William," she replied, a smile playing on her lips, "my love, my equal, my home." It was not a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of something better, a real partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, admiration, and a love earned through shared battles. That night, as Thornfield slept and the stars bore witness, Margaret and William began not just a marital union, but a complete fusion of two spirits that Edmund had seen as complementary from the very beginning. And on the tomb of Isabel and Edmund, if anyone had been present, they might have sworn they saw a soft light glow for a moment, as if two ancient spirits were celebrating the union they had orchestrated with a love that transcended life and death. 3 years passed like the gentle breath of spring, slow but transformative. Westfield under Margaret and William became something remarkable, a kingdom where change was not feared but celebrated. The school now had 150 students, 3 buildings, and a curriculum that included not just classical studies, but practical sciences, arts, and even physical education. Kate, now 17, taught literature. Anne, fascinated by the natural world, studied botany under scientists William had brought from Cambridge. The hospital had grown to 4 doctors, 15 nurses, and specialized wards. Infant mortality in the region had dropped by 40%. William published medical papers that circulated throughout Europe, establishing Westfield as a center for medical innovation. But it was in May of 1820 that the greatest transformation of all occurred. Margaret woke feeling a familiar sickness. She had suspected for weeks, but confirmation came when the palace physician examined her and declared with an immense smile, "Congratulations, Your Majesty. You are expecting an heir." The news spread like wildfire through Westfield. Spontaneous celebrations erupted. But for Margaret and William, the moment was more intimate, more precious. "Her baby," William whispered, kneeling before her, his hands resting reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our child, or daughter," Margaret corrected, smiling. "And if it is a girl, I want to name her Isabel, for a queen I never met, but whose kindness still lives in every reform we make. And if it is a boy," William countered, "Edmund, because he deserves to be remembered not just in history books, but in the line of succession he worked so hard to protect." In the end, it was a girl. Isabel Margaret Thornfield was born in January 1821 during a snowstorm that turned Westfield into a white wonderland. She had strong lungs and fists that gripped fingers with surprising strength. When Margaret held her for the first time, exhausted but triumphant, something completed in her. She had been merchandise, then a queen, then a wife. Now she was a mother, and no title she carried was as precious as this tiny being who depended completely on her. "She is perfect," William whispered, touching his daughter's tiny cheek. "Just like you." "She will have everything we lacked," Margaret vowed, watching the perfect little face. "Security, unconditional love, freedom to choose her own path. And she will grow up in a kingdom where a woman is worth no less than a man, where compassion is a strength, not a weakness." The little Isabel was presented to the kingdom in a simple ceremony in the royal chapel, placed symbolically over the tombs of the original Edmund and Isabel. It was as if two generations were meeting, the one that had planted the seeds and the one that would bloom from their roots. The projects continued to expand. Margaret established a fund for widows, ensuring no woman would be left destitute as her mother had been. William created a training program for rural doctors, spreading healthcare throughout the kingdom. Visitors came from all over Europe to study the Westfield model, a combination of traditional monarchy with progressive reforms. Margaret received queens, princesses, and duchesses, all fascinated by how a girl with no lineage had transformed a small kingdom into a beacon of hope. On a spring afternoon in 1822, Margaret visited Edmund's tomb. Isabel, now 15 months old, crawled among the headstones while Margaret arranged fresh flowers. "You were right about everything," she said to the cold marble. "About William, about the kingdom, about me. You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I was unlovable. And you gave me a future when all I expected was to survive." She touched the inscription. "Isabel is growing strong. She has your eyes, Edmund. Kind eyes that see beyond surfaces. And I swear I will teach her everything you taught me. That power serves the people, not the self. That compassion is not weakness. That true love is giving without expecting return." A soft breeze moved her hair, carrying the scent of roses from the gardens. Margaret chose to believe it was an answer. Thomas Blackwood appeared in the cemetery, his movement hesitant. He visited often now, maintaining a respectful silence, never presuming the forgiveness Margaret had already granted. "She is beautiful," he said, watching his granddaughter. "Just as you were at that age, before I destroyed everything." "You cannot change the past," Margaret said gently, "but you are changing the present. The work you do managing the housing program is important. You are helping families avoid the fate ours suffered." "It is the least I can do," Thomas murmured. "It will never be enough." "Perhaps not," Margaret agreed, "but it is a beginning. And beginnings are what Edmund taught me to value." That night in the grand hall where the council met, Margaret presided over a discussion about expanding reforms to the kingdom's more distant regions. She wore her crown, but it did not feel heavy. She wore her authority, but she did not feel imprisoned. At her side, William participated equally, not as a shadow, but as a true partner. They disagreed sometimes, debated vigorously, but always decided together. Lord Pemberton commented after the meeting, "You two govern as Edmund and Isabel governed. As partners, not as master and servant." "Because Edmund taught us," Margaret replied, "that good governance begins with a good partnership." As the years passed, Edmund's legacy grew not in statues or monuments, but in transformed lives. Every educated child, every healed patient, every family lifted from poverty was a living tribute to the king who refused to leave the world as he found it. And Margaret, who had entered Thornfield as purchased merchandise, now walked its halls as a queen who had proven that value comes not from blood, but from character. She had been sold for £20,000, but she had bought herself back with something money could not buy: dignity, courage, and a love that multiplied instead of diminished when shared. The spring of 1823 brought challenges that tested everything Margaret and William had built. Poor harvests in the northern part of the kingdom caused food shortages. Prices soared. Families who were finally recovering once again faced starvation. Margaret convened the council immediately. "We must act. Open the royal granaries, distribute the stored grain, import food from neighboring regions. That will cost a fortune," a new Conservative councillor, Lord Ashton, objected. "The royal granaries are for war emergencies, not for—" "Not for what?" Margaret interrupted, her voice icy. "Not for saving our subjects from starving to death. Hunger is a greater emergency than any war." "With respect, Your Majesty," Ashton continued, "excessive charity creates dependency. People must learn." "People are dying," William cut in, supporting Margaret immediately. "We will not speak of moral lessons while children cry from hunger. The granaries will be opened. Food will be distributed, and we will use our personal resources if necessary. The council reluctantly approved. In the following weeks, Margaret and William travelled personally to the affected regions, not as distant monarchs but as present leaders. In one particularly devastated village, Margaret found a woman holding a malnourished baby. The child had sunken eyes, skin stretched over small bones. Margaret took the baby with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "What is your name?" she asked the mother. "Sarah, Your Majesty. And my daughter is Mary." "Mary will live," Margaret vowed, handing the baby back with a basket of food. "And you will live, and this kingdom will never allow this to happen again." She turned to an official accompanying her. "I want a program of regional reserves established. Granaries in every county, kept stocked year-round. We will never be this vulnerable again." That night, in their makeshift quarters at a local inn, William found Margaret crying silently. "It's too much," she whispered. "Every time we solve one problem, another arises. People suffer, and I can't save them all." William knelt before her, holding her hands. "You cannot save them all, but you are saving many. That baby, Mary, will live because you acted. Sarah will have food, because you refused to accept the answer that charity creates dependency. Edmund chose right, Margaret. You are exactly the Queen Westfield needs. And if I fail, what if everything we've built crumbles? Then we will rebuild," William said firmly. "Together, as we always have." The food crisis was overcome, but it left its mark on Margaret. She became even more determined, more vigilant. She established early warning systems for harvests, diversified food supplies, created emergency funds. It was also in this year that Margaret did something radical. She convened a popular assembly. Not just nobles, but elected representatives from every town and village. It was a primitive form of parliament, where the people could bring concerns directly. The council resisted furiously. "This is democracy in disguise," Ashton protested. "Your Majesty, you are undermining royal authority." "I am strengthening it," Margaret corrected. "A strong kingdom listens to its subjects. A weak kingdom ignores them until they rebel." The first assembly was chaotic. Farmers argued with merchants. Artisans debated with landowners. But gradually order emerged. Solutions were proposed. Compromises reached. It was messy, imperfect, but it was the beginning of something revolutionary, governance that included the governed. Margaret's visits to Edmund's crypt became more frequent. She spoke to the tombstone as if he were still present, reporting progress, confessing doubts. "Sometimes," she admitted one afternoon, "I wonder if you would know what to do. You always seem to have the answers. I just have questions and hope the right answers appear." William's voice came from the shadows. "Edmund didn't have all the answers. He was just better at hiding his doubts." Margaret turned. "You heard him doubt?" "Constantly," William smiled, "especially in the last months. He would ask me if he had chosen right, if you would be strong enough, if I would be wise enough. He wasn't omniscient, Margaret. He was just a man doing the best he could with the time he had left. So he trusted us to complete the work." Margaret understood. "Exactly. And we are. Every popular assembly, every regional granary, every reform. We are building on the foundation he laid." Margaret looked at the tomb, then at William. "He gave us more than a kingdom. He gave us possibility. And we are turning possibility into reality." William extended his hand. "Come, my queen. Our daughter is waiting, and I am certain Isabel has already caused some adorable chaos." They left the crypt together, walking through the gardens where Edmund's roses still bloomed every spring. And if the ancient stones of Thornfield could speak, they would say they had never seen a kingdom ruled with so much heart. Because Margaret governed not just from her head. She governed with the memory of hunger in her own belly, of fear in her own heart, of pain in her own soul. And that memory, that empathy born of suffering, was what transformed a good queen into a great one. The autumn of 1825 painted Westfield in hues of gold and amber. Margaret was 27 now, William 38. Little Isabel, at 4.5, ran through the gardens of Thornfield like personified wind, dark hair flying, laughter echoing against the ancient stones. Margaret watched from the library window, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. A second child was on the way. Edmund, they decided, if it was a boy, because although Queen Isabel would be the heir, the name Edmund deserved to continue. William entered, carrying a stack of documents, but stopping when he saw Margaret's gaze. He joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands over hers on her stomach. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured against her hair. "About how much has changed," she answered softly. 8 years ago I was merchandise being transported in a golden carriage, terrified and alone. Now, Now I am a mother, a wife, a queen, not just by title, but by earned right. Edmund would see this, William said, and smile until his face hurt. It was true. The kingdom had transformed in ways even Edmund might have found remarkable. The schools were now 4, educating 300 children. The hospital had saved thousands of lives. The popular assembly system had evolved into regular meetings where subjects truly had a voice. Kate, now 23, had become a prominent educator, publishing treatises on universal education. Anne, 21, was studying medicine under William's tutelage, the only woman in a field dominated by men. Elizabeth lived comfortably on a small estate, healthy and happy. Thomas still worked in the social programs, his redemption silent but real. The Blackwood family, once ruined and desperate, had flourished under the shadow of the crown Margaret wore. But perhaps the greatest transformation was the one no one saw, the one that had occurred inside Margaret herself. She no longer shrank when men challenged her. She no longer doubted her right to speak, to decide, to govern. She had found her voice and used it not to dominate, but to elevate. That afternoon, Margaret visited the crypt for the last time before the birth of her second child. She knelt before the tombs of Edmund and Isabel, now bearing fresh flowers she had brought herself. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for freeing me, for orchestrating love when I thought I would never deserve it. You died, Edmund, but your heart still beats in every reform, every life saved, every child educated." She touched the cold marble. "And I promise, this kingdom that you loved, that you protected, that you entrusted to me, I will protect it, not just for myself, but for Isabel, for the Edmund not yet born, for generations to come. Your legacy will not end with me. It has only begun." When she returned to the palace, Margaret convened the council for a final announcement. "I have been thinking," she began, her voice firm, "about succession. Isabel will be queen one day, but I do not want her to face the challenges I faced. So I propose constitutional changes." She unrolled a document she had spent months drafting. First change, guaranteed succession regardless of gender. The firstborn rules, be it boy or girl. Second change, mandatory education for all royal heirs on governance but also on common life. I want my children to know the farmers, the artisans, the people they will govern. Third change, the popular assembly becomes permanent with expanded powers. Monarchs will rule with the people, not over the people. The council sat in shocked silence. These were radical changes, each one slightly eroding the absolute power of the monarchy. "Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton finally said, "this is revolutionary." "It is evolution," Margaret corrected. "Edmund began by transforming a purchased queen into a legitimate ruler. I am completing the transformation by making the monarchy something that serves the people, not something served by them." William supported her immediately. "I move for a vote. All changes proposed by Queen Margaret shall be implemented." After heated debate, the changes were approved, not unanimously but by a sufficient majority. Westfield had become something unique, a monarchy that had evolved, that had grown, that kept tradition but embraced the future. The second child was born in December, during the first snow of winter. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with blue eyes that resembled Edmund's. "Edmund William Thornfield," Margaret announced, holding the baby against her heart, "Prince of Westfield, and heir to the throne after Isabel." When they showed the baby to his older sister, Isabel touched the tiny face with gentle fingers. "I will protect him," she declared solemnly, "just like Mama protects me." Margaret and William exchanged looks, their hearts overflowing. This was the true legacy, not just laws and reforms, but values passed from one generation to the next. Years continued to pass. Margaret and William aged with grace, grey hairs appearing, lines forming around eyes that never lost their sparkle. Isabel grew strong and intelligent, absorbing lessons of governance like a sponge. Young Edmund proved to be a natural peacemaker, always mediating squabbles between other children. The school where it all began became a university. The hospital expanded to 5 wings. Westfield prospered economically, as refugees from less tolerant regions immigrated to the kingdom, where compassion was state policy. In the spring of 1835, when Margaret was 37, she published a treatise on governance that circulated throughout Europe. It was titled simply, "From Merchandise to Monarch, Memoirs of Transformation." It told her story without embellishment, the sale, the terror, the transformation. But more importantly, it shared the lessons Edmund had taught her, that true power is serving, not dominating, that compassion is not weakness, but the greatest strength, that love multiplies when given freely. Queens and princesses across Europe read it. Some dismissed it as radical. Others saw in it The seeds of change their own kingdoms desperately needed. Margaret became a symbol, proof that origin did not determine destiny, that a woman could rule as wisely as a man, that a system could evolve without bloody revolution. On a summer evening in 1840, Margaret and William sat together in the same gardens where they had first admitted their feelings 15 years earlier. They were older now, their bodies less agile, but their souls still intertwined. "Do you have regrets?" William asked, holding her hand. Margaret thought for a long time. "I wish I had known Edmund when he was healthy in his prime. I wish I could have thanked the original Isabel for the kindness that inspired him. But regrets? No, every moment of pain brought me here. And here," she squeezed his hand, "is exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Edmund knew," William murmured. "From the beginning he saw what we would become." "He didn't just see it," Margaret corrected. "He created the possibility. But it was we who realized it. Every choice, every reform, every battle. He planted the seeds, but we made them bloom." Isabel, now a young woman of 19 about to take on more royal responsibilities, found them there. She sat on the grass at their feet, her head resting against Margaret's knee. "Tell it again," she asked, as she had thousands of times in her childhood. "About the king who bought you and set you free." And Margaret told once more the story of a dying man who used his last months to orchestrate not tragedy, but hope. Of a love that transcended death, of a kingdom that chose evolution over stagnation. It was a story that would be told for generations, written in books, taught in schools, whispered as legend. But for Margaret it would always be, quite simply, the truth. The truth of a girl purchased for £20,000 who had bought herself back with something infinitely more valuable. The courage to believe she deserved more. The wisdom to use power to liberate, not imprison. And love. Love for a kingdom, for a family, and for the man who had seen her when she was invisible. The sun began to set over Thornfield, bathing the ancient stones in liquid gold. And Margaret, Queen of Westfield, wife, mother, reformer, looked out at her kingdom and knew she was no longer merchandise. She would never be again. She was free, complete, whole, and that freedom was the most precious crown she would ever wear.